Did Keir Starmer's government quash the trial of suspected spies to protect the UK's relationship with China? George, this is a story about espionage. It should be instantly exciting, but it's actually been surprisingly tricky to get a handle on. I mean, would you be able to give us a kind of Cliff Notes version? What's happened? Why has this proved so controversial? What is the China spy case affair?
That's right. So it dates back over several years. Two men, Christopher Cash, a former parliamentary researcher, to Alicia Kearns, a former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and Christopher Berry. They were arrested under the Official Secrets Act in 2023, accused of spying on behalf of China. They deny the charges. They were then charged in 2024. That case was set to go to trial, and essentially the prosecution collapsed. And there's now huge political row in Westminster, essentially the Conservatives accusing the government of engineering that for political purposes, and Starmer and his ministers adamantly denying that.
Like you said, it's worth clarifying, Cash and Berry both consistently deny any wrongdoing. But they're accused of essentially sort of collating information about the British political scene, political figures, and that being sent on to sort of a senior figure in the Chinese Communist Party. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Now, where it gets complicated is why did the case collapse?
Yes.
And the government essentially argues that the relevant laws were under the Conservative government. They argue that for the prosecution to be successful, China would have had to be deemed a threat to national security at the time when the alleged offences were committed. Now, threat is a word that lots of Conservative ministers used casually about China, but it was never officially designated a threat to the UK. There was backbench pressure on Rishi Sunak to do that. So Labour argued that meant that the evidential bar for a successful prosecution was not cleared.
So, George, just to kind of put the CPS's side of the argument across, they say that essentially the case has been dropped because the bar for evidence has changed. Stephen Parkinson is the Director of Public Prosecutions, saying that under case law in 2024, there was enough evidence. However, since then, there has been this case, another spying case, some Bulgarians who are accused of spying for Russia, and that was in court in March of this year, and that a new precedent has now been set. And now China would need to have been labelled a, quote, threat to national security at the time of the alleged crimes. This is all then further complicated by the fact that initially these guys, they were charged under the Official Secrets Act. This is archaic bit of legislation, archaic in its language that dates back to 1911. If they were to be found, arrested, charged now, it would actually be the UK National Security Act of 2023 that they would be charged under, which has more modern language, and they would only need to be designated as spying on behalf of a foreign power. However, it happened before that legislation came into effect, and that is why this is so complicated, and we can see the sort of competing narratives, political narratives coming forward and this area of contestation.
That's completely right. And that's why you've got into this political tit for tat where Labour's essentially saying, well, we couldn't prove that China was a threat at the time because you were the guys in government and you didn't officially designate it a threat. And they are replying, we believe the likes of Simon Case, former cabinet secretary, unusually have gone public on this.
Done so in the New Statesman.
Yeah. And arguing that, implying that had there been political will, then you could have seen this case proceed.
Katie, I'm not an expert in China or indeed possibly even in foreign affairs, but it seems
No, that's too harsh.
It seems it's
you
pushing.
Kind to yourself, Ollie.
Okay, maybe I should be kinder to myself, but it seems to be pushing the bounds of credulity to suggest that China isn't or wasn't a threat to Britain in 2023. Can you give us a sense of sort of is it actually that controversial to describe China as a threat or an enemy?
Well, I mean, if you look at the successive national security documents and policies of British governments over the last decade, it seems to be quite hard to use that word. I was based in China during what is now fairly excruciating to recall as the golden era of UK-China relations under David Cameron in 2015. If listeners remember, that was the era when Xi Jinping and David Cameron very casually and totally naturally had a pint at a pub in Oxford, and I think Xi Jinping was kicking footballs around. But this was also a time of, a massive domestic crackdown in China, really clear repression. And I think we've seen sort of since then various iterations of British governments trying to grapple with that fact and find a way to describe the very concerning both domestic and external behavior of China under Xi Jinping, but trying to sort of fudge it in the rhetoric they use. So you get, in 2021, China is a systemic competitor. In 2023, when these offenses were alleged to have taken place, is an epoch-defining challenge. Under the current national security strategy launched in June, it's a geostrategic challenge. So I think you have this real reluctance to put it in plain terms and to say that, yes, the British government regards China as a threat in multiple spheres and dimensions, because the economic side of this relationship is so important and has clearly been so compelling to numerous British governments. So this is not just a current British government problem. This is kind of the crux of the difficulty of both wanting to do business with China and being realistic about the nature of the current Chinese government for successive British leaders.
Listeners may be familiar with the sort of domestic repression that happens in China. They'll almost certainly be aware of the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims, but they might not necessarily be aware of how China conducts itself on the international stage, or when you say that there's external pressure or external threats from China towards Britain. What does that look like, Katie? What does that mean in practice?
So firstly, I think if we just step back and look at how China sees this moment, I think there's a sort of continual desire in the UK and less now in the US, but to sort of get back to business as usual, get back to a period of greater stability. China believes, or at least the top level of the Chinese government and Xi Jinping, his catchphrase over the last few years is that we're witnessing changes unseen in a century. He sees this as a pivotal moment, that the international order is in flux. One of his other favorite sayings is that the East is rising, the West is declining. He thinks the future of the international order is being decided now, that powers like the US are ceding their primacy, that they are becoming weaker, they are becoming more divided, and that this is a moment of tremendous opportunity for China. So he thinks we're in this fundamental moment of systemic change in the international order. He also thinks that China is in this long-running, what he describes, or what a secret document that came out under his leadership describes as an intense struggle in the ideological sphere against what they call Western constitutional democracy and universal values. So he sees this as this sort of fundamental tussle to decide what the future of the global order is going to look like. So I think it's important to understand that when you then look at China's behavior. In terms of the immediate external security threats, I think the most obvious is China's support for Russia. It has been described by NATO as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine. I think it's credible to say that Russia would not be able to continue at the current level of its assault on Ukraine, which is no longer confined to Ukraine. We're also seeing Russia very clearly testing various NATO countries now. So if you accept that China is a decisive enabler of Russia's actions and that war is the most serious threat to international security and has very serious ramifications for the UK's national security, then it's not very hard to join those dots. Various levels down from that, then you have quite extensive what the UK securities describe as efforts at industrial espionage in the UK. There have been, again, according to the British security services, quite extensive efforts to recruit people in the UK on LinkedIn to spy for China. There is China sees the UK as a crucial player in what it regards as the broader firmament of the West. So, of course, it's going to be targeting the UK. And of course, China is going to be looking at ways to spy on the UK, as the UK will be looking at ways to spy on China. But I think it's just important to be clear about how important a moment China sees this, and therefore the importance of really taking this seriously and not viewing this as, one or two little road bumps and then we can go back to a prosperous trading relationship. This is a really critical moment as far as the Chinese government is concerned.
That's absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate the context you provided there, Katie. George, talk us through the sort of the main players in this story, particularly in the British government. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Jonathan Powell in the last couple of days because of the brilliant news that's come out of the Middle East. The ceasefire's been agreed there. His name's cropping up again, isn't it?
Yes, so I think it's worth giving listeners an idea of just how pivotal Jonathan Powell is in this government. So I don't think his official title, National Security Advisor, really does him justice. Essentially, he is the government's top foreign affairs advisor with a brief that spans all of the major global issues, pivotal, as you say, to the Middle East peace deal, who's pivotal to the détente between Zelensky and Trump after their White House dust-up early in the year, and admired in diplomatic circles as someone with a long record of peace negotiations, perhaps most obviously the Good Friday agreements, understood about during his time as chief of staff. Now, I think he's become a matter of political contention for several reasons. Partly it's that he's a special advisor. He's political, and that job is traditionally done by a civil servant. Partly I think it's that he was the longest serving aide to Tony Blair, so someone has been in and around Westminster a long time, has certainly made some enemies in that time. And then this is obviously become a flashpoint for, I think, a wider question over the UK's relations with China, which is at its heart a political one. And as Katie rightly points out, the Conservatives often talked a tougher game on China than they were ultimately prepared to pursue. It's a political judgment. Ultimately, do you want to define the world's second largest economy, a rising superpower, as an adversary and deal with all of the consequences that flow from that? That's ultimately the choice. Now, the charge that the Conservatives and government critics are levelling is that Powell himself was directly involved in the collapse of this case. Now, that's something that Dan Jarvis, the security minister, rejected in Parliament last night, suggesting that it was Powell's deputy, Matthew Collins, who was the key contact with the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, that led to consternation from opposition parties. Former Security Minister Tom Tugendhat accusing the government of throwing him under the bus. Matthew Collins, this is, the Lib Dems calling for his submissions to the CPS to be published. This is going to run and run. Jonathan Powell himself is due to appear before a cross-party committee of MPs next month. But as I say, in many ways, I think this has become a proxy for a bigger debate, which is the government's policy towards China. And there was a deliberate softening of that when Labour entered power. I think David Lammy as Foreign Secretary, Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, all thought that the UK was an outlier in the G7 in terms of the number of visits to China had dwindled relative to G7 counterparts. And no one was talking about returning to the so-called golden era of Cameron and Osborne, which was obviously widely ridiculed and seen as delusional. But they basically took the view, look, China's here. So it's not going anywhere. We have to deal with the world as it is. That means, for instance, having the Foreign Secretary, the Chancellor, the PM meet with their Chinese equivalents and do business. That's partly linked to economic growth. It's also linked to net zero. It's very hard to decarbonize your economy without relying on a lot of the clean energy tech that China provides. So I think they took a pragmatic view, but obviously that's a tricky balancing act. And there are some in government who think, as one minister put it to me, the government's been trying to ride two horses, which is to get close to Trump, but also to get closer to China. And they think you ultimately need to choose a side. There's this pending decision over the so-called super embassy, which is due to open in East London. That decision will land on the desk of the new Housing Secretary, Steve Reed, but there are ministers who are lobbying for that decision to be declined. Eyebrows are being raised in Washington. So the whole saga of the UK's relationship with China will extend well beyond the spy row.
Katie, I was wondering if you could talk in a little bit more detail about the sort of, primacy of the Chinese economy and that balance that successive British governments have had to strike between security considerations and economic ones.
China is the world's second biggest economy, was expected until pretty recently to be on course to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Those predictions have since been downgraded as China's having a number of economic problems of its own, not least a domestic housing crisis, perpetually weak domestic consumption, and it's very clearly a state-led investment model. So it's not quite the coming titan it was once reckoned to be, but it is very clearly one of the world's most important economies. And it has, as George alluded to, real dominance in renewable energy technology. So particularly like the batteries that are needed for electric vehicles, and really absolute dominance in solar panel manufacture. So it is both a leading player in these key, future technologies, and it's just a very big force in the global economy in general. And I think I'm often reminded, I interviewed Chris Patten, former governor of Hong Kong, a few years ago now about his memoirs about his time out in Hong Kong, and how he talked about these British business people and British politicians would arrive in Hong Kong and leave with their eyes just filled with pound signs at the prospect of, this great business that was waiting to happen if only they could secure access to the absolutely massive Chinese domestic market. So that has long been a factor in the British government's approach to China. But I think we've seen behavior that I think to China signals real weakness in recent years. If we stick with Hong Kong, there was a treaty in place between China and the UK that was meant to protect democratic rights in Hong Kong until 2047, after the British handover in 1997. Those rights under the system known as one country, two systems were meant to be protected for 50 years. Instead, what we saw was China cracking down on protests in Hong Kong, and then in 2020 passing this national security law, which effectively formally dissolves those democratic rights. We have seen a number of people tried and convicted on very clearly politically motivated charges, and Hong Kongers forced into exile, including in the UK. And in response, the UK effectively issued a number of very sternly worded statements, said they would think about sanctions, made it easier for Hong Kongers to come to the UK, but really had no teeth when it came to that response. And Beijing notices that, and it remembers that. I think, in dealing with China and Russia, I'm often reminded of the famous Lenin quote about probing with bayonets. If you find mush, you push on. If you find steel, you withdraw. So far, China is encountering quite a lot of mush. So I think while there is this clear, understandable reluctance to make an enemy of China, either rhetorically, formally in the language of this case, or more generally, there needs to be a better balance of being able to talk clearly about China's behavior, including its behavior towards the UK, without being too cowed by this fear of what happens if you offend China. Because the current policy of trying to placate China, it doesn't seem to be massively successful. And I think, just in broad terms, the Chinese government does not respect weakness.
We're sort of talking about Russia and China, Lenin's popping up, and I'm inclined towards, this might be too simplistic, but a sort of Cold War framing, that essentially we are still seeing that typical fault line between East and West, and that whilst the Chinese and Russian economies are integrating and indeed prosecuting a war in Ukraine together, if I follow the logic through and say, well, why would China want to spy on Britain, is the answer that actually Britain is very firmly integrated into the American security apparatus, that it poses possibly a mushy weak spot, as Katie has pointed out, as a mechanism or a place where the Chinese might be able to find an opening, whether it's via espionage, whether it's via sort of industrial espionage, whatever it might be, that they can apply pressure on the Americans. Is it correct to understand this in that framing of a kind of East versus West Cold War type situation?
Yes, I think that is absolutely the right framing, and is Britain seen as a weak link? And we've been here before with Russia and the London grad era, and we've had MPs only this week warned about the rising cybersecurity threats from China. Yeah. And so, look, I think there are some asking in government, sort of, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? What I think it is going to force the government to do is to make a clearer argument for its new approach to China, because, as I said, there has been a shift from the conservative era. They would argue it's a sort of resumption of normal diplomatic relations, which are used by all countries all major Western countries with China, including the US, despite the harsh rhetoric you hear from the Trump administration. But I think in some ways the debate on China and the UK has been too shallow, given its global prominence. I think Westminster has been playing catch up with the reality of just how big a force China now is on the world stage. And we should have, there were arguments for and against the government's approach to China. That debate should be had, just as we debated the UK's correct relationship with Europe, the nature of the relationship with the US, and that's an argument that's not going to be had within government too, because there are some ministers who, as I said, take a more hawkish view and think, much as Keir Starmer might have started off wanting to be everyone's friend, the nature of geopolitics could force you to choose.
Katie, what should our relationship or approach to China be? It seems like we're sort of sat here going, well, there's this huge economic, military, cybersecurity powerhouse that is sort of got its tentacles all over the UK. Is it sort of redundant to be like, well, the British should approach China in this way? Then the answer is, well, actually, your relationship with China is going to be whatever the Chinese dictate it to be.
I think George has a really key point there, though, of we need to be having this conversation out loud and in frank terms. I think trying to sort of pretend that this is not where we are and trying to just sort of manage it quietly and hope for the best is not a successful approach. So I think we need to be very clear about China's behavior, including its ongoing behavior towards Hong Kong, the very clear threat it represents to Taiwan. And, in the UK, we need to be having a public and a high-level conversation about what would the UK's approach to that be, because we are at a critical period there too. It's widely reported Xi Jinping has directed the Chinese military to be prepared to launch an assault on Taiwan by 2027. Now, there is no evidence he plans to do that. My personal view is that would always be an act of last resort. It is not something he would undertake casually, particularly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what he saw happen there. But nevertheless, I don't think there is really a deep, effective, clear public conversation in the UK about, would Britain take part in a US action to defend Taiwan? Would we get involved militarily? Is Taiwan critical to British interests? Is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, where the Royal Navy does take part in these freedom of navigation patrols? These are really critical live issues of national security. And I think we need to be very clear about that. And in terms of the economic side of this relationship, I think, the best model we've seen in recent years is actually Ursula von der Leyen's framing in the EU of this idea of de-risking from China. So there's a lot of talk before she came up with the de-risking framework about decoupling. So basically, should it be on or off? Should we now withdraw? Should we decouple Western economies from China? Her framework of de-risking, I think, is probably more realistic, where you identify what are critical technologies, what is key infrastructure, and to bring it back to the proposed super embassy, what could be national security threats? The real concern from the US about the Chinese embassy in East London is its proximity to communications hubs and the role that could play in a future conflict or for the potential for espionage. So I think that is probably a more realistic approach, to be clear about the need to cooperate with China economically, which is in China's interest too, which is not a monolith, and where there are very many companies, entrepreneurs, individuals who want to do business. But we should be very clear about where could China present a really serious national security risk, and to learn from the lessons of what happened with Russia, that these were not abstract concerns that could be put off indefinitely. So I think I would just absolutely foot stomp George's comment about, I think the problem here is that we're just not talking about this enough. And this needs to be an urgent, candid conversation about how the UK approaches China.
I'm very grateful to both of you for having this conversation now then, in that case, Katie and George. Katie, can I just, a quick bit of extra detail. There'll be people listening who have heard you just say there, would the UK become militarily involved if China invaded Taiwan? And they'll be thinking, what on earth are you talking about? An invasion of a small island in the Eastern Hemisphere? What on earth has that got to do with Britain's interests, with the West's interests? Can you just explain why that's relevant, and probably with specific reference to the sort of semiconductor chip industry?
Let me do my best. And in some ways, this is precisely the problem. So the issue of Taiwan's status, I will do the Cliff Notes version as briefly as I can of the geopolitics of this.
Could be a whole podcast, don't get me wrong.
A whole other podcast waiting to happen, Chris Stone. So when the US normalized relationships with China in 1979, the status of Taiwan was set aside. The US effectively acknowledged that China sees it one way, which is that Taiwan is an integral part of China, without agreeing that it saw it in the same way. Taiwan has since become an absolutely crucial node of the global semiconductor industry, specifically advanced semiconductors, which are absolutely critical to many of our technologies, and without access to which would have a really massive impact on the global economy and our regular ability to get things like advanced computers, electric vehicles. Taiwan is a critical node in the global semiconductor industry, to the point that has been talked about as a silicon shield, which is effectively preventing Taiwan from being subsumed by China, because China too is wary about tanking the global economy. The US approach to this has long been known as strategic ambiguity, where the US, there's a congressional act that requires the US to provide for Taiwan's defense. So the US sells it arms, but it doesn't commit the US to come to its defense. And the posture has always been that as long as China believes that there is a realistic chance that the US would come to Taiwan's defense, that will serve as a major deterrent. The problem is that in recent years, there's been increasing talk about whether the US would in fact do that. Donald Trump has been talking about Taiwan as language not dissimilar to you. It's a tiny island. It's very close to China. It's very far from the United States. It might be too far away to defend. So China is assessing who would come to Taiwan's defense. And I think the real danger here is that if Xi Jinping comes to believe that the US is a paper tiger, the West is not going to be coming to defend Taiwan, then that adds to the ledger that suggests this wouldn't be as wholly reckless as it would seem right now. And the UK is a member of NATO. It is arguably the US's closest ally. So if there is a very live and real debate here in the United States about whether the US would and could defend Taiwan. But I don't think there is the same level of discussion in the UK about that. And the UK could very quickly, if the US gets involved in fighting a war with China, I think it's hard to imagine that the UK could just keep its head down and not have to confront that at all. So I think it's just another example of, we need to be talking about this and having really serious discussions about this. Because if China believes that those commitments are credible, if it believes that the US and the UK are going to be leading an allied defense of Taiwan, that makes military action much less likely.
Cliff Notes Guide to Taiwan when, Katie Stallard?
I saw you looking at your watch, Ollie, so I ended my comments. I took the hint.
No, it was great.